Today I'm reading from Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. Introduction, Day 4. It was useful, anyway, to be known to the murderous capo from a favorable angle, so I applauded as hard as I could. Generally speaking, of course, any pursuit of art in camp was somewhat grotesque. I would say that the real impression made by anything connected with art arose only from ghost-like contrast between the performance and the background of desolate camp life. I shall never forget how I awoke from the deep sleep of exhaustion on my second night in Auschwitz, roused by music. The senior warden of the hut had come some kind of celebration in his room, which was near the entrance of the hut. Tipsy voices bawled some hackneyed tunes. Suddenly there was a silence, and into the night a violin sang desperately sad tango, an unusual tune not spoiled by frequent playing. The violin wept, and a part of it wept with it. And for that same day, someone had a 24th birthday. That someone lay in another part of the Auschwitz camp, possibly only a few hundred and thousand years away, and yet completely out of reach. That someone was my wife. To discover that there was any semblance of art in a concentration camp must be a surprise enough for an outsider, but he may be even more astonished to hear that one could find a sense of humor there as well. Of course, only the faint trace of me, and then only for a few seconds of or minutes. Humor was another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self. To discover that there was any semblance of art in a concentration camp must be surprise enough for an outsider, but he may be even more astonished to hear that one could find a sense of humor there as well. Of course, only the faint trace of one, and then only for a few seconds or minutes. Humor was another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. I practically trained a friend of mine who worked next to me on the building site to develop a sense of humor. I suggested to him that we would promise each other to invent at least one amusing story daily about some incident that could happen one day after our liberation. He was a surgeon and had been an assistant on the staff of a large hospital. So I once tried to get him to smile by describing to him now how he would be unable to lose the habits of camp life when he returned to his former work. On the building site, especially when the supervisor made his tour of inspection, the foreman encouraged us to work faster by shouting, "Action, action." I told my friend, "One day you will be back in the operating room performing a big abdominal operation." Suddenly, an orderly will rush in announcing the arrival of the senior surgeon by shouting, "Action, action." Sometimes the other men invented amusing dreams about the future, such as forecasting that during a future dinner engagement they might forget themselves when the soup was served and beg the hostess to ladle it from the bottom. The attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is some kind of a trick learned while mastering the art of living. Yet it is possible to practice the art of living even in a concentration camp. Although suffering is omnipresent, to draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to that behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. It also follows that very trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys. Take an example, something that happened on our journey from Auschwitz to the camp affiliated with Dachau. We had all been afraid that our transport was heading for the Mathusen camp. We became more and more tense as we approached a certain bridge over the Danube, which the train would have to cross to reach Mathusen. According to the statement of experienced traveling companions, those who have never seen anything similar can possibly imagine the dance of joy performed in the carriage by the prisoners when they saw that our transport was not crossing the bridge and was instead heading only for Dachau. And again, what happened on our arrival in that camp. After a journey lasting 2 days and 3 nights, there had not been enough room for everybody to crouch on the floor of the carriage at the same time. The majority of us had to stand all the way, while a few took turns at squatting on the scanty straw, which was soaked with human urine. When we arrived, the first important news that we heard from older prisoners was that this comparatively small camp, its population was 2,500, had no oven, no crematorium, no gas. That meant that a person who had become a Muslim could not be taken straight to the gas chamber, but would have to wait until a so called Sikh convoy had been arranged to return to Auschwitz. This joyful surprise put us all in a good mood. The wish of the senior warden of our hut in Auschwitz had come true. We had come as quickly as possible to a camp which did not have a chimney, unlike Auschwitz. We laughed and cracked jokes in spite of and during all we had to go through in the next few hours. When we knew arrivals were counted, one of us was missing, so we had to wait outside the rain and cold wind until the missing man was found. He was at least discovered in a hut where he had fallen asleep from exhaustion. Then the roll call was turned into a punishment parade. All through the night and late into the next morning, we had to stand outside frozen and soaked to the skin after the strain of our long journey. And yet we were all very pleased. There was no chimney in this camp, and Auschwitz was a long way off. Another time we saw a group of convicts pass our work site. How obvious the relativity of all suffering appeared to us then. We envied those prisoners their relatively well regulated, secure, and happy life. They surely had regular opportunities to take baths. We thought sadly they surely had toothbrushes and clothes brushes, mattresses, and separate one for each of them, and monthly mail bringing them news of the whereabouts of their relatives, or at least of whether they were still alive or not. We had lost all that a long time ago.